When I introduced Dr. North a little while ago, I said he didn't need much of an introduction. And if he didn't need one then, he certainly doesn't need one now. So we're just going to welcome back Dr. North.
In my first presentation on evangelism, I made the statement that David Watson described himself as a church planter, but not a church builder. So he understands the difference between the two. The problem that we have and have had for 2,000 years is that when a church begins the evangelism program to be really effective, it has to have a program different from what it becomes or adopts after the time that the great period of growth is over. And for every local congregation, at some point, the period of growth will be over. There are a few cases where churches will become mega churches, but even in those cases, at some point the church will stop growing, and then it gets into a position of building a new organization. So there is a difference between what I would call planting churches and building churches, and the difficulty has always been the transition from the phase of growth and evangelism, where the church is being built up and then is followed by that consolidation phase, and that's when the evangelism almost always ceases, unless there's some way that the local built-up congregation can then support missionaries. But as far as we know, in the past, when the church locally gets enough money to start sending out missionaries, they do not set up downline churches, home churches, comparable to the ones that David Watson set up. And so the church in the foreign country has no more growth than an established church has, and the established church has almost no growth. So then the technical, institutional problem is this: how does a local church that originally began in a house church mode in some far-off country, how does that church make the transition to a built-up, established church that is beyond a house church environment, the kind of church that the world has been familiar with for almost 2,000 years? How is that transition made? And then secondly, what happens to church growth when that transition is made? And that problem has not been solved, and that is the problem that needs to be solved, and needs to be solved very rapidly. It's not good enough to say that we have a phenomenal program for growing churches in the church planting movement outline that David Watson created. It's not enough to say that we're successful in doing that if we ignore what that church should look like after it has started a church that has started a church that has started a church. And on the other hand, of what growth orientation, of what growth benefit will an established church be if it simply reproduces foreign versions of itself and therefore does not experience the downline experience that David Watson's ministry has had? How do we get the two together? And I want to talk about, first of all, as we go through this material, what the church is in terms of covenant theology. What do we know it has to be if it is to become and remain faithful to the standards of covenant theology? So the focus of my presentation in the first half is going to be defining and describing the church in the framework of the covenant model, which I've called the 5 5-point covenant model, and then get to the question of how it takes advantage of these breakthrough strategies that Watson and others have built up over the years. How does it move to that phase and still maintain its character as an established or built up church? Let's talk about the church covenant. And this is going to be very basic material. Some of you are familiar with this, but it never hurts to review the basics from time to time. Let's talk then about the biblical covenant model. Now, I have been using this systematically for 30 years. This is the 30th anniversary of the publication by the Institute for Christian Economics of Ray Sutton's book, That You May Prosper, and it is also the 30th anniversary of the other book that it published in that same year by David Chilton, the commentary on the book of Revelation, and that book adopted the same model, the 5-point model, that Ray Sutton had adopted for his book on That You May Prosper, or what was subtitled Dominion by Covenant. There is a transcendent God, yet he is present with us. That's the first point of the covenant. We could call this the sovereignty of God, but it is more specific than simply predestination. He is transcendent, yet present. Now, the biblical God is both. If God were only transcendent, he would be the God of deism. He started the creation, he wound up the universe, and then he went on permanent vacation. He is an observant God at best. He does not interfere with historical processes. He is therefore too distant to make a difference. He started the world, he does not complete the world. On the other hand, if we say that God is exclusively a God of presence, he becomes the God of zero transcendence whatsoever, a God who is part of the universe, a God who is not in control over the universe, the God, in other words, of pantheism, who at best is an evolutionary God who evolves alongside the creation and occasionally interferes with it. That's the God of process theology. That's the God, basically, of historical evolution. It's a God who does not interfere, does not direct the processes of history. Biblically, we have to affirm both. There is hierarchy, point 2 of the covenant. God is over man, man is over nature. We get that, of course, from Genesis 1:26 through 28, which I have called the dominion covenant. The God is ultimately sovereign, but he delegates sovereignty to man to serve as his representative agent, which is why point 2 of the covenant also and inevitably involves representation. That man represents God in history and brings God into history by means of man's representation. God does not exclusively sit over the world and use man as a puppet, but in fact came into history in the person of Jesus Christ, participated in history to redeem the world and to build his kingdom. So God is both God and man. And the doctrine of the incarnation makes it inescapably clear that man has a fundamental task in history, because if that were not true, why did God have the second person of the Trinity be incarnate in the form of Jesus Christ, a living person in history? And then, of course, nature is under the dual authority of God and man. Ethics, you have to have a system, you have to have law. This can also be called stipulations. And ethics is fundamental to the covenant. The covenant is not impersonal, it is personal. Ethics always is a matter of personal intervention, personal standards, stipulations, in other words, and they are legal. And God holds men accountable to them. And the covenant cannot be accurately discussed apart from an understanding of ethics. Then there is the oath, and that is the oath that affirms the covenant, that places the oath taker under the sanctions of the covenant. And then there is succession, which is the succession of men and institutions over time. The oath establishes the covenant, but all men die. And the oath then must be carried on in history. The oath is basic to the sanctions of life. The oath affirms the sanctions of life. They are called self-maledictory oaths. The covenantal oaths are self-maledictory. They call upon God to impose his negative sanctions on the oath taker if the oath taker breaks the oath. On the other hand, the oath taker wants positive sanctions in response to faithful covenantal obedience, adherence to the ethics of God. And if there are no sanctions that are consistent with the ethics of God, then there cannot be the development of the kingdom of God in history. Because the positive sanctions of the oath taker and of the covenant itself are not worked out in history in a predictable way, with covenant blessings going to those who are covenantally faithful and covenant cursings coming upon those who break the covenant. If we don't have positive sanctions and negative sanctions in history in terms of the oath itself, then we cannot see the development of history in terms of the covenant. The covenant then becomes separated from history on the fringes of history, not the powerful force that shapes history. The Dominion Covenant is the model for all of this. I use that as the original title of the first volume of my economic commentary on Genesis. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. And in the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. So you have God establishing the covenant. God is the source of the covenant. God is the power behind the covenant. God is the sustainer of the covenant. God is a covenantal God. Man is made in the image of God, therefore man is a covenantal agent. Man is made in God's image. He cannot escape the covenant and the covenant structure. He has a task that has been given to him by God. There has to be law, and in this case, the law of multiplication is the obvious one. And as some cynic once said, it's the only law, it's the only commandment given by God that everybody wants to fulfill. So we have a situation in which law is endemic to the covenant, establishes the covenant, judges the covenant, and gives us confidence in the covenant. Why? Because of sanctions. That the positive sanctions of life are consistent with the covenant law itself, and the negative sanctions of life are also consistent with covenant law. And then there is time, or the doctrine of the future, but basically it's the doctrine of time. The time has relevance in history because of eternity. The time is clicking day by day. The clock is ticking. Of course, they don't click anymore. They don't tick anymore. They are silent. But in my generation, we used to say that the clock is ticking. It's ticking in terms of the sanctions. It's ticking in terms of beginning and end. It's ticking in terms of creation. Creation, fall, redemption, and finally the new heaven and the new earth, which end history. But time has meaning in terms of the covenant, and only in terms of the covenant. Now, this is fulfilled, obviously, in Matthew 28:18 through 20. And Jesus came and spake unto them, saying, All power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even until the end of the world. Amen. It's called the Great Commission. It is the New Testament manifestation of the Old Testament's dominion covenant. It is the fulfillment of the dominion covenant, but it is also the empowering of the dominion covenant. And it places the gospel at the heart of it. It places the church at the heart of it because of the necessity of discipling the nations. It places law at the heart of it, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And God will be with us through Christ until the end of time. So let's, with this in mind, talk about the church covenant. It begins with the doctrine of the Trinity. We are not Unitarians. And if we begin with the doctrine of the Trinity, then it means that we begin with the doctrine that establishes the principle of the one and the many. The one and the many teaches that God is a unity in diversity. There are three persons, and yet God functions as one God. The church reflects this. The church is a body of believers, and body is the right analogy or metaphor. Paul says of the members of the church, we are of one body. He says that in 1 Corinthians 12. He says it in Romans 12. That's the language he uses. So the individuals are members. The individuals are members in the sense of members of a body. Again, it's the analogy of unity, and yet that does not deny the reality and the responsible reality of individuals. The Bible is the authoritative announcement of what God requires. It's the covenant document. And the covenant really is part 2 of the covenant model itself. And the Bible represents God in history, speaks on behalf of God, speaks in the name of God. The Bible is the representative agent in history, and it's permanent, and it is not going to change. We do not add to it. We have to have it at the center of worship, at the center of teaching. The Bible enables us to know what the hierarchy is all about. God over man over nature. The Bible is, in this sense, a textbook. And any attempt to say the Bible is not a textbook of whatever is an attempt by a guy with a PhD, probably in a state university, who is getting a fat paycheck and does not want to talk about the Bible in the classroom, because if he is speaking in this way, he's likely to be fired. He wants to keep his job, and so he says, the Bible is not a textbook of my discipline. Well, it is the founding principle by which the textbooks should and will be written. Then there is the creed. There has to be a confession of faith. The creed establishes the law of the covenant, ecclesiastically speaking. How do you know you're a member of the church? Because you're a member in good standing. Well, how do you know? Because I have affirmed the creed of the church, I have affirmed some basic confession of faith, and I have not departed from that confession of faith. Then there are the sacraments. They are oath signs. That phrase comes from a theologian named Meredith Kline. He was the first one really in the Calvinist circles to talk about the 5 points of the covenant, but he didn't want them to be associated with the New Testament. He wanted to confine them only to the Mosaic Law, because he doesn't like and didn't like Mosaic law. But he called the sacraments oath signs. Baptism is an oath sign. The Lord's Supper is an oath sign. They are manifestations of an ultimate oath, an ultimate commitment to the creed, to the Bible, and to the Trinitarian God of the Bible. It's an oath-based sacramental church, and if you don't have the Lord's Supper, you don't have excommunication. If you don't have excommunication, you don't have discipline, and if you don't have discipline, you don't have the church. And then there is eschatology, and everyone has an eschatology. And the great battle in the modern world, certainly since the time of Darwin, late 19th century, has been the battle over eschatology. Premillennialism, amillennialism, and postmillennialism. And the issue has yet to be settled to the satisfaction of the various institutional churches. There's only really agreement, ecclesiastically speaking, on the doctrine of the Trinity. The creeds are not the same, although generally most churches affirm either the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. The sacraments, that's a great debate between Protestantism and Catholicism. And of course, eschatology is a great debating issue within the Protestant churches. Generally, Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy are amillennial. 3 marks of the true church. Whenever we talk about what is going to be the church after this great period of evangelism, whatever we sit down and decide the church is going to be, the church is going to have these 3 marks. Preaching of the word. Okay, that's point 2 of the covenant. It's based on the Bible. There has to be a presentation of the gospel and the requirements of the gospel. Then there are the sacraments. The sacraments are basic to affirming commitment to preaching, confirming commitment to the creeds of the church and the various council statements of the church throughout history. The sacraments are the basis of church discipline. If you are not under church discipline, you are not a church member. It's very clear. You have to have church sacraments. If there were no church sacraments, nobody could be excommunicated. If sacraments were not important, excommunication would be not important, and so forth. Then there must be discipline. Discipline in terms of a creedal statement, discipline in terms of required sanctions. If you don't have the preaching of the word, which basically preaches the law, if you don't have sacraments, which are the affirmations of the law, and if you don't have discipline, which enforce and defend the sacraments, you do not have the church. This has been certainly the position of historic Calvinism, stretching back into the 16th century, but it would also be acceptable to the Roman Catholics. There'd be disagreement on what constitutes the sacraments. That's a different matter, but all of them affirm the sacraments. Now, 3 marks of a church member. They'll be similar. There's got to be a confession of faith of some kind, an affirmation. This confession of faith is going to be enforceable. So somebody has to make a confession. Now, this confession can be made representatively, at least that is the position of those people who believe in baptism of infants. The parents make the confession of faith, but they do so judicially on behalf of the child, and the child is placed under the confession of faith. Now, most Protestant churches have some reaffirmation at some point of some kind, where voting church members have got to say that they agree at least to obey the church, and they have some minimal confession of faith. There's no agreement across the board as to what a church member must confess. It's really pretty vague. Pastors are held to a stiffer and more detailed confession than church members are. Then there has to be participation in the sacraments. Most Protestant churches want sacraments at least once a month. Some say once a quarter, and some say once a year. But if there is no participation in the sacraments, there can be no excommunication. The whole idea of communion, which is the name for the Lord's Supper, the communion has to justify excommunication. So there is no discipline within the church if there is no participation in the sacrament. If the church does not police the boundaries of the sacraments and enforce that barrier, then excommunication is meaningless. And there has to be an outwardly moral life. That gets back to the issue of ethics. So, has to be confession, that's an oath. Has to be obedience, that's ethics. Has to be participation in sacraments, that's the nature of the sanctions. Any church that does not have these is not a church, it is an imitation. This is basic to defining the church and the church member. Now, if there is any kind of evangelical program that does not tell men early that this is what it means to be a church member, if that evangelism does not tell these people what a church is, then it is profoundly erroneous evangelism, and it's going to have to be cleaned up at some point in the presentation of the gospel. We have the issue then of biblical interpretation. If we say that the Bible represents God, if we say that the Bible is the foundation of the creeds and the confessions of the church, then how do we know what the Bible teaches? If we don't have a theory of biblical interpretation, we are simply spouting nonsense when we say the Bible is authoritative in all areas of life. If we don't have a means of interpreting specific biblical passages and applying them to specific historical circumstances, then it's all talk, no action. It's walking the walk, but no talking only of the talk that makes a Christian church enforceable. If you don't walk the walk, then there's no excommunication. And then you're not a Christian. You have to do what God says. And that's clear in the Great Commission, teaching all people to do what I've commanded. That's the whole point. But then what has God commanded? There has to be grammar. You have to understand the basics of the original languages, and you have to know how to apply the basics of Greek, Hebrew, and briefly Aramaic in Daniel 4. You have to be able to apply those languages to your own spoken tongue. And we can do this. And if that were not true, then there couldn't be the gospel. And then Wycliffe Translators organization is wasting its time, but it isn't wasting its time. There has to be grammar, and you have to know something about the historical setting of the grammar. Sometimes this is called grammatico-historical interpretation. And Reformed churches always say that they conform to grammatico-historical interpretations. They require pastors to pretend that they can read Greek and Hebrew, and except for about maybe 20% of them, it's simply fake. They use all of the electronic tools everybody else uses to figure out what the text is actually saying, but maybe 20% of them can read it, and maybe 4% of them are fluent, and they'll be the guys who conduct the language examinations at the presbytery meetings. But basically all it's saying is there is a way, language to language, to bring the message of the Bible accurately into the language of the people. Then there is theology. Theology does not interpret itself. Biblical passages do not interpret themselves. Interpretation is basic to the understanding of the meaning of a text, and interpretation is always heavily reliant upon a particular theology. Now, is this clear? In other words, this is another way of saying there's no such thing as theological neutrality. Philosophical neutrality is a myth. Theological neutrality is a myth. So there's got to be a big picture that enables us to understand the little picture of a particular verse in the Bible. But in order to understand a particular verse, you have to understand the big picture. What are we back to? It's the Trinity. It's the one and the many. The many passages that we want to interpret have got to be interpreted in terms of one grand theology, which holds all of the pieces of the puzzle together. And of The theological systems in Protestantism, Calvinism, is the most detailed, most systematic. Calvinists live and die institutionally in terms of their defense of their theology. They're also supposed to know grammar, but they've got to understand theology. Then there is symbolism. Sometimes this is called rhetoric, but let's call it what it is, symbolism. Jesus says, I am the door. Well, what does that mean? I am the door. What does that mean? The parables are filled with symbols. Jesus talks about the kingdom is like, and then he tells us what the kingdom is like. There's a symbol as to what the kingdom is like, and we don't understand the kingdom well until we understand the symbol. So we have grammar, we have theology, and we have symbolism. By the way, this is sometimes made familiar by the old system of medieval academia, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. They're analogous. It's the same application. There has to be grammar, which is understood historically. There has to be theology, which gives us a framework to understand the grammar, and there has to be symbolism or rhetoric to drive home in our minds the sophisticated theology that we have developed out of the grammar. If there's no impact, then why would Jesus have said the kingdom of God is like something? To speak to the people who listen to them, Jesus relied on symbolism. Well, we have to do the same, and we have to conform our interpretation of Jesus' symbolism to what our theology and our grammatical understanding of the passages tell us that the symbolism must have meant. It's a package deal. It's a trinity of interpretation. And we need the Holy Spirit to apply this in our thinking and our lives. Now, I believe in precision through division. That's because I'm a Protestant. But even the Catholics have a lot of precision through division because you can't get a Jesuit to sit down in the same room as somebody who is a follower of Francis and get them to agree on much of anything. Not tactics, not theology, not interpretation, not much of anything. So there's always precision through division. Grammar. The grammar of the faith is presented in the creeds of the faith. The famous ones are obviously the creeds known as the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. And these established the church in 325, at least the Nicene Creed did. And that was the only thing the church ever came to an agreement on. And it meant that the Arians, who were basically Unitarians, were wrong, and that if you were a Unitarian or an Arian, you were not a Christian, you were not allowed to participate in any way in the sacraments, and it was a life and death issue. Theologically speaking, it was an eternal life and death issue, but if you know anything about the battles of the 4th century, it was a physical life and death issue. People were persecuted and executed based on their confession of faith. Well, that's the grammar of faith, and we have recitation of the Apostles' Creed, or we have recitation of the Nicene Creed in Presbyterian circles because we say we have continuity with the early church. Well, what do we say we have continuity with? We don't believe that it's a continuity based on the laying on of hands. So what is it a continuity with? It's a continuity of confession. So the church has to have a grammar of faith. Then there is theology. These are the more detailed confessions. The Westminster Confession of Faith, the larger and shorter catechisms. These are highly detailed confessions of faith that distinguish us as Presbyterians from Roman Catholics or Lutherans. So it gets more precise. The divisions get stronger. We find that there are theological battles that are fought on the basis of rival confessions of faith within the church. Now, the rival confession with respect to original creeds, that separated insiders from outsiders. The confessions of faith that have taken place since the Nicene Creed have been confessions of faith within the camp of the faithful. And then there is symbolism, and that is seen in liturgy. And if you want to find out what people really want to fight about, it's liturgy. There are people in churches who aren't able to give you a clear statement of Calvinism or Arminianism, but they know one thing. They know how their grandfathers worshiped, and that's how they're going to worship. Granddaddy did it this way, and we're going to do it this way, and get them guitars out of this room, which is a big split in the church. And by the way, there was a big fight in the Presbyterian Church back when there was no Southern Church and Northern Church in 1860. May of 1860. The Civil War was about to be launched. The secession movement began in South Carolina that December, and you know what they were fighting about? They were fighting about whether the organ is a Romanist importation or not. That was the big issue. And the church within a year split between North and South. The country split within North and South. And you know what? They never did get it straightened out as to whether the organ is an instrument of Rome. And nobody fights the organs anymore. They're just going to fight the guitars. Now we have the issue of the church as a community, because the church is a community. We call it the body of Christ. There's inside versus outside. Now we know that was settled in 325. Are you a Christian or not? Depends on your willingness to confess a Trinitarian creed. So you've got to make a decision. I want to see it in terms of organizational structure as the difference between the castle and the barbarians. It's the English versus the Viking barbarians in the 9th century. You're inside or you're outside. Those inside are confessional Christians. Those outside are lost. They're barbarians. You can see it in terms of friends versus strangers. This, in terms of Christian community, is basic. Are you a friend or not? That means, what's your confession of faith? Where did you become a member? What oath have you officially said is your oath? What have you confessed? Friend or foe? Friend or stranger? Trust versus distrust. Do you trust the person or not? What's his confession? Is he outwardly obedient to that confession? Is he predictable in terms of that confession? Because the guy outside the church, if he's really conforming to his confession of faith, is going to be at war with those of us who are inside. Jesus said, "Those who are not with me are against me, and those who do not collect with me will be scattered abroad," or scatter abroad. There's trust and there's distrust. Then there's port versus storm. And when times get tough, when times get scary, as times do from time to time, that's how we decide who we trust to get us through the storm. The church is the port in the storm. Now, this leads to another issue. Elect versus lost. And that's the big one, isn't it? That's the big one. Now, Arminians say election, but they don't really believe it. Calvinists say election, and they do really mean it. And the lost are really lost from the foundations of the world, and the elect are really elect from the foundations of the world, and there is no peace between them. There can be a truce, but there can be no peace between them in history. Now, how does this affect the next issue, offensive versus defensive? For there is a mindset associated with inside and outside. And those who are inside can then take one of two pathways. offensive versus defensive. Now, everybody says, I believe the gospel is positive, and everybody says, I believe there is a hell and people have to be saved from hell. And everybody says the church has got to defend itself, and everybody says the church has to have an evangelism program. But ultimately, a church, institutionally speaking, is going to side with the offensive definition of the church, that is offense-oriented, versus the defensive definition of the church. Winners versus losers. That's the big one. It's saved versus lost. But now we're talking offense or defense. Is the church inherently convicted of the fact that in history there are winners and losers, and that covenant keepers are winners and covenant breakers are losers? And almost nobody believes that. Now, they may believe it with respect to salvation. Of course, they believe it with respect to salvation. And they believe it with respect to church membership. The winners are inside and the losers are outside. Do they believe it with respect to history? And in this case, with the exception of the postmillennialists, they are defensive. They don't believe that covenant keepers in history, institutionally, are winners. There's blessed or blessed versus cursed or cursed. People believe it individually. People believe it with respect to eternity and history. But do they believe it with respect to the institutional church? There, they don't believe that the church will be blessed in history as a winner. They believe that the church ultimately will be threatened with cursing, and that in the case of Van Til, at least, he said the only thing that will save the church at the very end of history is the second coming of Christ, who intervenes to stop the final phase in which covenant breakers finally and definitively curse the church and block any growth of the church. And then Jesus comes back into history and delivers us from history. Premillennialists usually go with the position, at least the dispensational premillennialists go with the position that this takes place at the rapture. And then there is victory, but only on the far side of the second coming, only on the far side of the resurrection, when Jesus is going to put resurrected Christians in charge of an international bureaucracy, and then we're going to bang a whole lot of heads. Retribution is coming, guys, on the far side of the second coming. That's the position of the premillennialists. Adopted versus disinherited. You're adopted into the family of God. You are adopted into Christ's family. And if you stay in Adam's family, you are disinherited at the end of time, definitively disinherited, obviously, at the resurrection, and progressively disinherited through time. Now the question is, will this adoption be manifested institutionally in terms of the church as a community? And we're back to the eschatology question. Yes, everybody says things will be much better inside the church than outside, but not in terms of political power, not in terms of academic influence, not in terms of cultural manifestation. There, the pessimillennialists are dominant, both pre-mill and post-mill, and they say that the church will increasingly become isolated in terms of its influence. And I have used the example of saying it's the barbed wire Presbyterian church or the barbed wire Reformed church. There'll be theological rigor and precision inside the concentration camp. Inside the barbed wire of the concentration camp, there'll be a second barbed wire around the church, but it will have no influence inside the concentration camp generally. Then there's the foot versus footstool. This is the language of Psalm 110. It's the language of 1 Corinthians 15, 24 through 28. Is the church going to be the foot or the footstool in history? Now, everybody says the church is going to be the foot in eternity, and we'll put our feet on the footstool. But the problem is the footstool's in the resurrected horror of hell, which is dumped into the lake of fire, we're told in Revelation 20, 14, and 15. So you don't really stick your foot on the footstool of hell because you burn your heel. So then the language has no meaning for eternity. Well, then what about in history? Are we the foot? Is Jesus going to place his foot on the footstool of civilization? And the postmillennialists are divided. The amill says it will never happen. The premill says it will happen after the second coming and the resurrection, which will be followed by the 1,000 years of millennial rule. And in that time, the church and Christians get to be feet, and the footstools will be those under our authority. The postmillennialist, the purest postmillennialist is the amillennialist who says that's never going to happen in history. We have rock versus gates of hell, Matthew 16, 18. Jesus said the gates of hell will not prevail against the rock. And everybody in the postmillennial camp has the image of the church defending against the gates of hell. The image is precisely the opposite of what Jesus said. The gates of hell shall not prevail against the gospel and against the church. It is the gates of hell that are defensive gates, not the gates of the front door of the church. I knew a man, he is a pastor in the Reformed Episcopal Church, and he was in Edinburgh on a Sunday. So he went to a Presbyterian church Sunday morning, and the door was locked. All the doors were locked, so he knocked at the door. And somebody inside came to the door and said, "What do you want?" And he said, "Well, I want to go to church here." And the guy said, "Why?" That's postmillennialism hardcore. And that's what happened to Presbyterianism in Scotland. Do you know where Knox is buried? He's buried in a parking lot. There used to be a plaque on top of the space, and it got pulled up. Christian church as an army. A guy I knew years ago, at least 30 years, probably closer to 35, a black pastor, once had a wonderful phrase. He said, "When I took over as pastor of the church, I thought I would be the head of an armory. I found I was the head of a nursery." Armory versus nursery. The Christian church in the West is fast becoming the nursery, not the armory. You come into the church and there's a nursery for the kids. There's a nursery for the kids of all ages. And that's the problem. We sing "Onward, Christian Soldiers," and yet person by person in the pews, we find that we don't believe it. Most people don't believe it. We're barely moving onward, and surely we are not Christian soldiers. Headquarters versus rest and recreation. Which is the church? Is the institutional church, the local congregation, the headquarters for training up the officers in the church, who will in turn train the non-coms, who will in turn train the enlisted men? Is that the image we have of the church? Generally, it is not. The church is seen as rest and recreation. We go to the church on Sundays to get out of the battlefields of life. We're back to the imagery of the port and the storm, but now it's military. Headquarters versus rest and recreation. Enlistees versus civilians. Those inside the four walls of the church who have pledged allegiance to the oath of the church, the enlistees who were there because they enlisted, are distinguished from civilians. Is that how we think of the distinction between the world around us and the world inside the four walls of the church? Enlistees versus civilians. This is a military way of looking at it. Brotherhood versus clubs. We think of the church as a brotherhood. Now, it's legitimate. We sometimes, at least in fundamentalist circles, call each other brother this and brother that. There is a sense of brotherhood. We are certainly brothers in a family, and the family we are in by adoption, and the adoption is by Jesus Christ. So yes, we are brothers in the faith. And then outside are clubs, voluntary societies of some kind. Is the brotherhood fundamentally different from the clubs? And it is. And why do we say that? Because of the oath. We are an oath-bound brotherhood. Now, there are oath-bound brotherhoods that are not ecclesiastical. One of them is the state, the civil government. We are oath-bound. You take an oath of allegiance to the state. That, in fact, is how you have to get into the military. You have to go by way of an oath. You have to take an oath of allegiance. If you don't take the oath of allegiance, you're not sworn in. That's also true of people who want to become citizens, who are foreigners. They have to take an oath of allegiance. So there is a sense of a brotherhood, and military units are unquestionably brotherhoods. They see themselves as brotherhoods. Do we see ourselves as Christians as part of a brotherhood or part of a social club? There's no question that inside the mainstream or mainline denominations, they see themselves as members of a social club. And that's why they are failing. That's why the commitment is so minimal. There is a brotherhood, and is a brotherhood of the battlefield, enlistees and not civilians. Sacrifice versus shopping. Do we sacrifice to become participants in the church or not? Do we see ourselves as sacrificing? Or is it basically something like a shopping mall? And every once in a while you see a church that buys up a shopping mall at a really good price. I've seen that done. I'm in favor of it. It can work. But the problem is the liturgy tends to look more and more like the shopping mall than the brotherhood of military participants rather than simply civilians enjoying rest and recreation as members of a social club. We should not see the sacrifice of faith as being comparable to shopping. Rushdoony had the phrase, he said that Americans pick their churches on the basis of something like some kind of restaurant where you go and you say, well, I'll take a little bit of that, and no, I don't think I want any of that. And, oh, I don't touch that stuff at all. He said, that's how we pick and choose in terms of churches. We church shop on that basis. It's some tremendously great, big spread discount restaurant that we go through. Well, that isn't what the church is, and it isn't what the church should be. It should be shopping in terms of, do I want to get into a church that sees itself as the Marines? Or am I content to get into a church that sees itself more like one of those beret groups? You know, which really hardcore church do I want to join? That's not how we select our churches. That's how the average person doesn't select the church that he joins. Now, with all of this as background, with the covenant model as background, with membership as background, with the concept of grammar, logic, and liturgy as a way to distinguish a church, with the idea of the church as an armory and not as a nursery, with all of this as background, let's talk about the positioning of a local church. Of course, it affects the positioning of a denomination as well. There is a mission statement. Does a local church have a mission statement? Businesses have them. They better have them. If you don't have a USP, it is called a unique selling proposition, you're going to have a big trouble with your business. Everything in your business must reflect the unique selling proposition. Well, it's not a unique selling proposition in the church. It's a unique service proposition. How How does your local congregation view its task of local service? How does it define itself? It had better define itself in terms of a published mission statement, and that mission statement should apply to every aspect of the church. The liturgy, the preaching, the organizational structure, the way you collect the money, the way you spend the money, the way you present the gospel to newcomers who are coming in the doors of the church. Even if you have to unlock the door of the church to let the guy in, you've got to have a mission statement. If you don't have it, then you're making a serious error, because you cannot determine what your task is within your community, within the confessional arrangement of the various congregations and various denominations. You're just going to be a lukewarm church. You're going to be the ecclesiastical commitment of cornmeal mush. And that then will shape the division of labor. Now, there is a division of labor. We see the division of labor in 1 Corinthians 12, church as a body with members. We see it again in Romans 12. There has to be a division of labor. Every church cannot be everything to every person who comes in off the street. Black churches do not effectively evangelize Asians, and they never will. And Asians aren't real good at evangelizing Anglos. There should be congregations that have members of both two, maybe three groups, just to say, yes, in principle, there's unity. But that's not how you're going to grow the church. You've got to tailor your presentation to a particular group, racially, economically, linguistically, especially linguistically. You have to figure out what's the hook in the gospel that will appeal to this particular person. If you are in the direct response marketing business, as I have been for over 40 years, and you go to a businessman and you say, who should buy your product? There's one word you don't want to hear, and that word is everyone. If he says everyone should buy my product, he's in trouble, and you're not going to be successful in selling him on what you need to sell him on. You have to have a particular person in mind, and so does he. You can't afford the advertising budget to sell your product to everyone. You can barely afford an advertising program to sell to one member of some technically skilled group isolated on the fringes of a relatively small market. That's who you're going to sell to, not to the masses. Now, the church as a whole is to sell to everyone. If you ask, who should the church appeal to, the answer is everyone. But if you ask, who should my local congregation appeal to, it had better not be everyone, because you're going to be closing the doors of that congregation soon enough. You've got to have a targeted audience who speaks the same language. Don't try to target a mission organization in a foreign country in which the missionaries don't speak the language of the country. That seems obvious, but it applies to the whole ministry of the Church of Jesus Christ collectively. And it surely applies to specific ministries of specific congregations. There's going to be liturgical positioning. And if somebody walks in the door and determines that that wasn't what his mother took him to, and his grandmother took him to when he was a boy, he's going to walk out. He's going to feel out of place. Now, you can get people to switch. It's possible, because they do switch. But they're going to be outsiders who have made a decision to switch, possibly to the liturgy, because they are real outsiders. They're from a foreign country. And so somebody whose parents were raised in Korea, which has been the great area of foreign mission success for Presbyterianism, that person is familiar with at least traditional Presbyterian liturgy. So this Korean may walk in the door of a Presbyterian church and not a Korean Baptist church, because he's committed to the liturgy, because it feels comfortable to him. But these cases are exceedingly rare. So you've got to make a decision on the liturgy. When somebody walks in the door, what is the person going to think? Is the person going to be comfortable? And if you have a complex liturgy, you better have training for the newcomer, not in your theology, but in terms of the liturgy. And whenever you go to a new members class at a Presbyterian church, you get 0 on the liturgy. Do you think anybody walks in the door of a Presbyterian church for theological reasons? When was the last time you met anybody who made any decision about anything based on theology, self-consciously? The next one will be the first one. They make decisions based on social class. They make it based on liturgy. They make it based on what's comfortable. They don't make it on theology very often. And if you think that's why they make the decision, you're not going to have a very large church. You're going to have an isolated church that is tied to theology and self-consciously tied to a specific creed or confession, but the liturgy is going to be an afterthought, and it's going to send mixed signals to somebody walking in the door. Now let's talk about Sunday services, because that's what evangelism of a church building is about. I'm not talking about a home church. I'm talking about a church with a building. Once that building goes up, the day of the home church is over, and that church is going to change. And the guys involved in church planning ministries are completely aware of this. They understand it. They know that once a church puts up a building, everything changes. And it changes to Sunday services and the focus of Sunday services. Okay, I'm going to break it down into grammar and theology and rhetoric, basically. Grammar, the grammar of the faith. The grammar of the faith is 11 a.m. to 12. Sorry, I put a.m., I meant p.m. You've got to get your grammar across to a newcomer in 1 hour, or you're in the wrong church. You've got to make the presentation, the total presentation, whatever you're going to try to get across to this person in 1 hour. Now, you can go 10:30 to 11:30. You can do that. I wouldn't count on it. People aren't used to it. They're used to 11 to 12. Evangelism service. So what should you do in evangelism? You got to sing some songs, and they better be simple hymns. Hymns about loving Jesus. Hymns about conversion. Hymns about I was lost, but now I'm found. That's what you put in an evangelism service. And whatever you have in terms of recitation, it had better not be the Apostles' Creed. It had better be a Bible verse that is related to evangelism. Members invite friends and meet them at the door, or maybe pick them up. It's an evangelism service, so you've got to evangelize. So you're working on the person on a regular basis. Why don't you come to church with me? Why don't you come to church with me? Make him give an answer. I don't like church. But he's going to feel, if you don't bug him too much, he's going to feel bad about it. Really, you ought to bug him until he just says, I don't like church. And then you say, oh yeah, well, why don't you invite church? Why don't you like church? You see how we go. Every answer that he gives, you pop him with another question. Members invite friends. And if you ever get to so many members in the congregation that you can't seat any new friends, then nobody should be allowed to come to the Sunday 11 o'clock service unless he brings a friend. That's the rule, and you better enforce it. After church prepared lunch for first-timers, I think this is basic. We think of the church as tied to the holy meal, communion. Well, it is tied to a meal, and Jesus preached at the Last Supper. It is tied to a meal, so bring some casserole dish, bring something, and invite somebody to stay afterwards. And if the person doesn't show up, well, then you can go to the meeting if you bring some food. And every person who showed up, walked in off the street, gets this free meal, at least the first time. Now, you don't probably want to run this thing as a rescue mission. There's a perfectly good reason to start a rescue mission, just don't make it a Sunday morning rescue mission at the main congregation. Have some reason, have some benefit. And people come in and they'll remember the fact. They're not going to remember what that sermon was about unless they get converted. They're not going to remember the term paper that your pastor read to them, because that's what Presbyterian and Reformed sermons are. They're verbal term papers. That's what Presbyterians are trained to do in seminary, and that's what they do. But members don't remember. They're going to remember that meeting afterwards. They're going to remember that somebody cared enough about them to invite them and their families to church. Now, maybe they're busy. Maybe they don't want to come. Well, then you give them what we call a rain check. I don't know why they call it that, but that's what we call it. Well, come back next week. If you'll come back next week, you're able to come back again. We'd like you at the meeting, and we'd like you at the meeting after the church where we get together and we eat and you meet everybody. You'll enjoy it. Well, they probably will enjoy it. The wife will not have to make a meal next week, and they won't have to go to McDonald's. It'll save them some money, and they'll come. Why don't you have this after every meeting, Sunday morning meeting? Now we get to theology. Now, theology is the 8 a.m. to 9:15 a.m. service. That's where you teach the confessions of the church. If you are tied to the Westminster Confession, that's where you teach it. Now, the Dutch do it differently, at least they used to in the good old days. They had to go through the Heidelberg Catechism. They went in the evening, and that probably gave the Christian Reformed Church maybe an extra generation before they started ordaining women. That bought them a generation. But I don't think that should be the focus of the evening meeting. That should be the focus of the 8 a.m. to 9:15 meeting. That's where you train the man who wants to be a consistent Christian. That's where he gets his theological foundation. And you bring in the kids. You have to bring in the kids. You teach them to sit quietly, and if you absolutely can't stand it, you just can't stand another squirmy, screaming kid, then you set up a children's church for the kids up to maybe 7 years old or something like that, first grade. But that's where you get your theological training. Don't give this at 11 a.m. That's not the 11 a.m. sermon. That's going to be a Presbyterian sermon that is really a term paper. That's the advanced upper division term paper sermon that he's going to give you. That's where everyone is fighting to stay awake and not just the visitors. So in the 8 a.m. sermon, that's where you have to have the theological training going on. And if you don't have that, you're not going to get warriors. This is where you train your non-commissioned people. This is where the private first class gets his training. And then he gets to be a corporal. And you may even have some three-striped sergeants, because you got to have trained people. And that's where you train them in the catechism. That's where you train them in the confession of faith. And then theology, the next phase of theology, that's Sunday school. And that's where you train the kids, and that's where you train the adults who want more training. And it's got to be less rigorous than the 8 a.m. training. There's some social work here, there's some social interaction, but that's where you really train the theology of the church for the newcomers, for the visitor who wants to come to a Sunday school. Really, he doesn't want to come to the Sunday school, but he knows his kid's supposed to have Sunday school, so he brings one of the kids, or maybe even both the kids. Maybe he drops them off. No, that's the wrong language. Maybe she drops them off and then picks them up at 10:30. But even that's pretty well faded. That was done 50 or 60 years ago. But the American culture has gone so far that the young mothers probably did not go to Sunday school anymore. There are multiple generations in between young mothers whose daughters, little girls, went to Sunday school and want their kids to go to Sunday school. Those days are pretty much gone. But at least you have kind of preliminary theological training, moving them in the direction of the 8 a.m. service. You want to get the 11 a.m. people to go to Sunday school. That's the goal. Move them into Sunday school. Then from Sunday school, you move them to the 8 a.m. service, where you get your training. Now, theology squared in the evening, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. That's where you train your church leaders. That's where you train your master sergeants. That's where you train the people who are the equivalent of the second lieutenants and the first lieutenants. That's where you train future pastors. Or that's where you train people who will go out on the mission field. And that's hardcore stuff. And that basically, if it were my choice, I wouldn't have hymns, I wouldn't have singing, I might have prayer. It would be theology. It would be training for the ministry. It's training people who want to be deacons. It's training people who want to be ruling elders. It's training young men who are thinking about going into the pastorate. It's hardcore. That's where you train the distinctives that make your local congregation different. And if you're post-millennial, that's certainly where you train them. You don't train them to be all-millennials and pre-mills at 6 o'clock in the evening. What I'm saying then is you've got to be able to sustain the revival. You need a sustained revival. The first presentation was on the planting of churches, but you have to sustain the revival. At some point, there's going to be one of these house churches where the head of the church says to the family that also has a church, let's have a meeting of all the families that have house meetings. Let's think about putting together a church with a building. That's going to happen. And when that happens, the character of the church will change. So now the question is, how do you retain the same enthusiasm? How do you retain the same commitment of a new convert after he has seen the house church for 15 years or maybe 5 years? And he says, is that all there is? It's not just Peggy Lee who's saying, is that all there is? Christians around the world are singing, is that all there is? And that's the opportunity we have with a hardcore message, theologically developed message. No, we say, that's not all there is. There's the question that somebody has who has come into the church, and he says basically this: what next? What next? You have to have an institutional setup that has specific programs that answer the question, what next? Or what now? What do I do now? If you don't have a systematic program that enables people to get practical answers to that question, then you don't have a church. You are not going to have any influence on people's lives. The excitement will wear off. Look, honeymoons don't last forever. There comes a point where you got to fix the meals and scrub the toilets. You've got to have a sustained revival. And that's what I want to talk about in this final section of the presentation. You have to have a permanent program of evangelism. Unquestionably, you've got to have it. This program has got to be effective. You've got to have places for people to go. There's just no question about it. You've got to have congregational or congregational prayer. If you don't have congregational prayer, you got a problem. I think up to 1 hour a day. I think you start praying for the revival for your church up to 1 hour a day. Now, I don't think it should be beyond this. Maybe for the elders, but not for the congregation. People can't do it. People won't do it. And if they do it for a month or even a year until the big evangelical meeting, then what? It'll fade. What I'm calling for is a lifetime of prayer. 15 minutes to start. No, too much? How about 5? Too much? How about 1? I mean, you can always negotiate. You can always negotiate. We learned that in the scene between Abraham and the angels. Well, how many people have to be converted, covenant keepers, to save Sodom? 20. Oh, would you do it for 10? I mean, we can negotiate. But let's negotiate. Congregational prayer up to an hour a day. You're praying for the revival. You've got to have a revival and sustain the revival. You've got to have a permanent program for recruiting, for baptizing, and leadership training. And it's got to be built into the church. And I think it has to be built into Sunday morning services. Recruiting is 11 a.m. and baptizing is at 11 a.m., but not the Lord's Supper. Lord's Supper should be weekly, and it should be done, probably, in my opinion, it should be done at the morning service. And it should certainly be done monthly. And if you have the Lord's Supper and it takes longer, then you better get there at 7:30. Because at 9:15, you have to send people out to either go into the Sunday school meeting or to pick up a friend, which is the recruiting program. So you have to have time after the 9:15 end of the meeting, either to go to the Sunday school or to pick up somebody you have invited to church. You need the recruiting, you need the baptizing, and then you need the leadership training. You start a little bit of leadership training, PFC, or maybe a corporal leadership training in the Sunday schools. But then you try to move them to non-commissioned status. And that's your 8 a.m. service, or if necessary, 7:30 a.m. service. That's where you train your lower level people who are going to be non-commissioned officers, low level guys who are going to be 3-stripe sergeants. You've got to have a model for other congregations. You've got to be able to say to other congregations, you can do this too. And you've got to be good enough so that other congregations say, well, how in the world did you do this? We'd like to do that too. Well, you better be ready to do it. You better have an operational model. You better have some kind of training program. It better be online. There better be YouTube videos. There better be a PDF downloadable manual. You've got to have something for other congregations to imitate you. And if you're not worth imitating, then you'd better get worth imitating. Zip code specific. You have to concentrate in your zip code. You've got to concentrate your revival program inside your zip code, because that's where the people are. You throw the hay down to where the goats can get at it, and they are goats, and you want to bring them into the sheepfold. You've got to have evangelism, and it's got to be sustained, and it's got to be comprehensive, and it's got to be in front of the congregation all the time. Bible studies in homes. That's one way of doing it. It's worked in the past. I think it can work in the future. You've got to make the real estate in your house productive for the Church of Jesus Christ. And real estate is an incredibly expensive barrier to the expansion of the church. You've got to find ways of getting more value out of the real estate. I hate the phrase more bang for the buck, but that's what you've got to get. You've got to have a Sunday school for children. That's the way you begin to get a revival. The adults don't come, or they don't pay much attention. But the kids have got to get the message. So tailor the Sunday school programs for kids. Start having Sunday school for young children early. Now, most churches have that. That's not a big deal. I really believe that's probably where most evangelism goes on in most congregations, is in the Sunday school for children who are under 8 years old. And by the way, that's a good place to learn how to be an evangelist. I once read of a seminary professor who made sure that every graduate of his program could present the gospel to a 3 or 4-year-old child. He said, if you can't do that, you don't understand the gospel. The 11 a.m. service is obviously an evangelism outreach, and you've got to think of it specifically as an evangelism outreach. You've got to have specialized evening seminars on pressing topics, parenting, money management. I have it maybe Thursday night, might be Tuesday night. You've got to have evening services. People are stuck. They are scared. They don't know how to meet their budgets. They are floundering. They will get help anywhere they can get it. They will accept advice from anybody who can help them. So set up evening programs or weekend programs, weekend seminars on money management, how to get your family budget back into shape. 3 hours, 9 to 12, and then have an afternoon one, 1 to 4. People will come. And if we get a recession, if we get a recession, when the great default hits, folks, there's going to be demand. If the next recession is bad enough, there's going to be demand. I've already begun to set up a program called Prayer for Jobs. Guys who are fired are terrified. If they think they can get prayer for jobs, they'll come at 6 a.m., they'll come at 5 in the evening or 6 in the evening. They're scared, and there will be a lot of fear to go around when this economy begins to unravel. Motivating members. You've got to have some program to motivate members to do something, because they're not motivated to do much. They come once a week, they toss a few bucks in the collection plate, and they go home. Morning service is where you motivate them. It's got to be training for the very beginning advanced trainers and very beginning advanced trainees. You got to have your top sergeants training the three-rank sergeants below, 3-stripe sergeants below them. You've got to have training that the 3-stripe sergeants can give to the next ones down, the PFCs. Right? There's got to be a hierarchy. Point 2 of the covenant. Everybody's got to train somebody unless you're 5 years old. And then you ought to tell your younger sister. There've got to be Sunday schools. They've got to motivate people to get out and do something. Move the Sunday school people out to invite somebody to the 11 a.m. service. The Sunday schools should be motivational. There've got to be prayer meetings. There've got to be at least 2 prayer meetings a week, in my opinion. Probably a Wednesday meeting and a Tuesday meeting. You have a healing meeting. Somebody's sick. Somebody needs help. Somebody needs this, that, or the other. Well, then pray about it. And don't stop praying until you get an answer. And if you start praying for somebody with cancer, there are only 2 reasons to stop. First, he dies. Second, he got delivery. Keep praying until then. Now, you may have a whole lot of prayers about cancer. Don't start praying about cancer or tuberculosis or anything else until you're committed to sustained prayer. It's got to reflect that sustained revival aspect. Then you've got to have prayer for the ministry, and that should be a different meeting. Are you having some kind of crisis in the church? Well, if it's public, then let's pray about it. Is there a planned revival campaign next year? Well, let's pray about it. Is there going to be a conference next year? Well, let's pray about it. Whatever the church is doing that needs to be prayed about should have its own separate meeting, right? Don't mix in the, Cousin Elvira has gout with the we need a revival because the church is about to go out of business and we got to have 20% more money coming in, which means we got to have 20% more people coming in. Actually, you probably need 40% more people because for the first year, the first 20% won't pay you anything. Divide it up. And if you have something bigger, maybe you're going to have a conference or a really big deal. Well, then you got to have a separate prayer meeting for that conference. And maybe only 10 people come. Well, then that's who comes. You got to have motivation in your sustained revival program. Zip code revival. I think you pray for problems in the community. Is there a big problem in your community? Well, then focus the revival on that problem. Is there juvenile delinquency? Focus it on that. What's the problem? What's the big problem in your community? Focus the revival and the prayer for the revival on that. Invite others to pray for local problems. Everybody thinks there are problems. Well, let's pray about it. Let's have a meeting about that. Create a website for community problems. Let's pray about that. Let's do something about that. Let's take some action. People may take action. Your zip code revival means that it is specific to the problems of your local zip code. If you get beyond the local zip code, you're going to dilute the message. If you dilute the message, people won't come. They won't respond. You've got to target your message to a specific audience. Then you've got to target your message to a specific problem within the specific audience, or they won't respond. Invite other churches to participate. That's probably the pastor's goal. There is a big problem somewhere in your community. The churches in the community ought to focus on solving that big problem and get every local congregation, or at least all the ones that are really evangelical, to focus next year on a particular problem. Specialize in ministry. What does your church do best? Do you work with the poor? Then work with the poor. Do you work with high school students? Fine, do that. Do you work with college-age students? Okay, do that. Have one ministry which is obviously your church's ministry, and then teach other churches how to do it. Get those training programs online, all those YouTube videos, all those PDF workbooks. Become the church in the country, or at least in your state, that specializes in a particular ministry where you can point to successes and say, this is how it's done, here is what we have achieved. If you want to achieve it, you achieve this. Real estate barrier, how are we going to get beyond that one, especially in Southern California or New York or Chicago? How do you grow the church if you can't put the people into the parking lot? Home churches, that's how you solve the problem. Multiple services on Sunday afternoon. That'll work for a while. It won't work for too long, but it'll work for a while. Rent empty spaces. How about daycare on the week? Maybe a daycare will accept your money. Public schoolroom, strip malls. In a recession, there are going to be strip malls that have vacant spaces. Okay, rent the vacant space. And if the church grows, then maybe you'll be big enough to rent the anchor that went down, because it shut down too. Rent space, build up space, never turn anybody away because there's no more space in the parking lot. But at some point, if you've got a really successful program, you're going to run out of space in the parking lot. Conclusions, you got to become more aggressive on evangelism, and it's got to start now. 72 hours. 72 hours after the conference. Less, really, because the conference where I'm speaking is on a Saturday. You don't have 72 hours. You got to start doing something by Sunday. If you put this on hold for a week, it will fade out. You got to take action rapidly. Persuade lay leaders of this responsibility. You've got to persuade people to do this, members of the congregation. You've got to persuade the leadership to do this, or it will not be done. I guarantee you, it will not be done. Develop a program for laymen to adopt. Laymen are the heart of this. Pastors are overwhelmed with responsibility. You bring in 100 new people, 100 people with financial problems, 100 people whose marriages are in trouble, 100 people whose families are being split by divorce. The pastors can't handle that if the program is successful. The laymen have got to do it. Deacons maybe are going to have to do it. Somebody's got to do it because the pastors don't do it. If a pastor looks and says, wait a minute, this program will be successful and I'll have to triple my counseling time and nobody's going to give me a raise, I don't think I'm really behind this program. And the pastor won't do it. It's not in his self-interest to do it. I've created a website for this. www.sustainedrevival.com. I go into the details of how you implement this. Hey, this is the close. I'm in direct marketing. Anybody worth his salt as a direct marketer is going to have a close. This is mine. www.sustainedrevival.com. Begin implementing what I have presented. Certainly begin implementing it within a month, something within a month. Preferably, you should begin looking at it no later than Sunday evening after the end of this conference. I wish you well. I wish you Godspeed. Go to work.